Behind me is Norwich Castle. It's one of the earliest Norman castles built in England. The Normans invaded England, Battle of Hastings 1066, most of you know that. This castle right here was built 1067, very next year. It was built as a symbol of Norman power. Norwich was an Anglo-Saxon town. You can tell that from the name. Wich is derived from the old Anglo-Saxon word meaning town. What this castle says is it says there's a new bunch of rulers in town. They're the Normans and they're in charge. This particular castle is a very early example of a Mott and Bailey structure. Mott and Baileys were a very simple type of fortification to build, quite often with conscript labour. What you would do is you'd take all the earth from an area, pile it up into a big hill, and that's the moat, and then you'd build what we think of as your castle on top of that. That's the keep, that's the big square thing you can see in the background. Around that there would be a smaller raised area, and in there you'd construct a fortified village, and you'd have a well, you'd have a barracks, you'd have accommodation for all the serfs and the people you didn't really want living in your castle, all the things that you would need to survive a siege. And the moat is your fortified castle bit, the bailey is a fortified village right next to the castle to keep it going, and that would be the local seat of power. Initially it would have been built of timber. The stone version you see behind me wasn't completed until the 1120s. And the reason that it was built of timber at first is because the earth has to settle. This was built in 1067. They didn't start to upgrade it to stone until the 1090s, and it took them 30 years to finish it. It was initially built as a royal residence. It was a palace rather than a serious fortification. Thing is, the royals clearly didn't consider it that palatial. There's no real evidence that the royal family used it much after it was built. The only extant source we have tells us that King Henry I spent Christmas of 1121 here, and after that it was never really used again. It just kind of sat there looking impressive. But it was a symbol of royal power. This was particularly apparent when a rebellion against King Henry II happened in 1173. That was led by Hugh Bigod, the Earl of Norfolk, who stormed the castle with over 800 men, about 300 of whom were Flemish mercenaries. They captured the castle, took 14 prisoners, and then just sat there and waited for stuff to happen. The rebellion fizzled out in the rest of England. Henry returned from France, mopped up the remaining rebels, and made peace with them. Hugh Bigod's castle at Thetford was destroyed. It was one of over 20 that Henry II pulled down to punish the rebels. But the royal castle at Norfolk remained standing. This castle was more than just a symbol of royal power. It was a symbol of a racial conflict that was going on in the area. As I said, Norwich was initially a Saxon settlement, and the Normans came in and they built this on top of the original Saxon settlement. They flattened over 100 houses, and they even tore down a local church. In the 1700s, a couple of hundred feet from here at the bottom of what is now called the Timber Market, a plumber was digging a drainage ditch and he came across burial remains. And when that was excavated for them to build Castle Mall in the 90s, they found that this was a previously unknown Anglo-Saxon church and burial ground. And to walk right into the middle of a Saxon settlement, flatten 100 houses and the church and their burial ground, that is a gigantic symbol that the Normans are now in charge, and they're in charge in a big way. And you Saxons had better like it or lump it. This created some tensions between the incoming Norman community and the existing Anglo-Saxons, and those tensions would come to a head in the next century. I'll go into that more in another video. The castle never really saw much use as a fortification or as a royal palace. The next big thing after the rebellion of 1173 to 74 was that the castle started to get used as a jail, and that happened from about the 1320s onwards. And it continued to be used as a jail right up until the 19th century. The only real break the castle took from being a prison was in 1549, when it became a hive of activity thanks to Kett's rebellion. Robert Kett was a local farmer, and he was leading local peasants who were angry about enclosure. They'd initially been destroying his property, and somehow they managed to persuade him to come round to their side and lead them. Kett and his army stormed the city of Norwich, kicked out a royal army and took control of the castle, and they ruled the town for about 6 months. A larger royal army responded by marching straight back up here. They smashed Kett's army at the Battle of Dussindale, and they hanged Robert Kett off the battlements of the castle as an example to the rest of the town. After that, the castle reverted to its use as a local jail. It was visited by William Howard when he was writing the state of prisons in England and Wales, and he visited here in 1775 and again in 1776. He notes that, apart from a couple of problems, there was a huge amount of rubble in the basement, and there was a cell that was used for male convicts that was regularly flooded in a couple of inches of water, which could not have been good for anyone. But apart from that, he was quite impressed at the conditions in the jail here. By and large, Norwich Castle was considered to be light and airy for a prison. The prisoners were well looked after, some of them even had a chance to ply their trade and earn a little bit of money. And that was important, because in a ratio of about 2 to 1, they used to keep debtors here. That means for every felon that was in Norwich Castle, they had 2 people who were in there because of their debts. All these people would pay money for the privilege of being jailed, and they would pay the jailer directly. This is actually quite a lucrative position. The jailer at this time didn't get a salary. What he did get was around about 2 shillings per week from every inmate, provided they were well looked after, plus administration fees. So he got 5 shillings for every debtor who went into the castle, and he got just over 5 shillings for every felon who went in for execution or transportation, and about 2 shillings for everyone who went in for a misdemeanour. There was generally about 30 to 50 inmates at the castle at any given time, and that could mean that as the jailer, you're earning up to £2.10 a week plus your bonuses. That's very lucrative for the 1700s. Unfortunately, the castle wasn't up to spec. There was major modifications done in the 1790s to try and rehabilitate it. They didn't work, and they had to go through another round of renovation in the 1830s. Unfortunately, none of these renovations had the impact of bringing the castle up to specification as a jail. After the new model prisons like Pentonville were opened in the early 1800s, the castle was just too outdated and it didn't survive. In 1873, a new purpose-built prison was opened at Mousehold Heath, and the castle fell into disuse. It was bought over by a group of citizens and went into public ownership in the 1880s, and in 1894 it was opened to the public as a museum, and it's still open today, serving that very function. What we are looking at is the Mott of Norwich Castle. As you can see, a motte is nothing more complicated than a large bank of earth that rises up to a fortified position at the top. This makes it very, very difficult to attack because you're going up a steep hill and the defenders are throwing big rocks and spears and shooting arrows at you and generally doing things to make your life complicated. It's difficult to get up, it is difficult to protect yourself while you're getting up, and if you make it to the top, you're knackered and someone stabs you with a sword. It's a very, very good defensive strategy, and it's something that it doesn't require a lot of specialist labour to build, which is why Mott and Bailey castles were so very popular in this period. As you can see, on top of the Mott is a keep, which is the big square stone bit, and there's a little walled bailey that sits there to this day. Traditionally, the bailey would actually have been off to the left, down in the southeast corner, where the castle mall now sits. What we see now is a landscaped garden, which is between the castle and the present day castle mall. This is facing roughly southwest, and that is the direction that the historical bailey would have been in. Today, it is no longer extant. All round the castle was an area known as the Fee. The Fee was a Norman part of the town, and it was where merchants tended to gather because they were exempt from local civic laws and jurisdiction. The Fee was directly the property of the crown, and this would create some tensions between the Normans, the Saxons, and particularly the Jews who tended to live in the Fee as moneylenders. But we'll go into that more in another video. Unfortunately, no trace of the medieval bailey survives, and what you do have to keep in mind is that redevelopment throughout the last 1,000 years has meant that the ground level today is significantly higher than it would have been when this was built. So you have to imagine that the ground here was maybe another 6 feet lower than it is today, making the Mott even more of an obstacle.